Welcome to MythVision Podcast. I have Drs. Richard C. Miller and Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. We're going to talk a little bit about a few ideas. I hope you join me on the wall as a fly, listening in. We're going to talk about myth making and the origins of Christianity and how Christians were totally fine with this literature, which clearly shows the signals of mythology, legend, fantastic story making. What happened or what we notice in how Christians are allergic to myth today, and then also the state of scholarship. I'm hoping to discuss what you find, and then maybe Dennis's observations pertaining to SBL, the state of New Testament scholarship, your hopes, where you think it could go if it was going in the right direction. And with that being said, I'm going to shut up and become the fly.
I think that one of the things I think about often, Dennis, in my own consideration of the origins of the religion was, to what extent were the earliest devotees cognizant of the mythology that was structuring their own devotion? And to me, it's telling that really this is the only religion that I'm aware of. If we go and investigate the other religions in antiquity, we don't have this kind of historiological concern with the other religion. If you go back to the origins of, say, Buddha or something like this, the earliest stories, you get folk tales, you get myths, and happily presented, and there's not a lot of concern over the historicity of all that, and in fact it's not even the point. You go back to Zoroaster, if you go back to any of the other traditions, the cults that were present that were running in parallel with Christianity at the time, Apollonius or Pythagoras, or you fill in the blank, the mystery cults. Not a lot, in fact that was kind of the point. It was part of the process of producing these stories, and so now it softens the idea of belief in a sense that people were indulging in these kinds of stories, right? Why is it then today that we place these demands on the text? They're really unfair to the text in so many ways, and unfair even to the earliest Christians and what they were doing. What's changed?
I think we need to take very seriously the European Enlightenment, and where science then became more important than other considerations. Because in the ancient world, what mattered most about their stories was not that they were true, but that they were more satisfactory to the identity of these communities. And these narratives, in many cases, are contentious to other narratives. And so what makes your narrative work for you is the cohesiveness that it gives to your community. So it helps you identify your in-group. It also helps you identify your out-group, because your narrative is different from the narrative of others around you. And this is one reason why mimesis is important, because it allows for a syncresis or a comparison of the heroes of your enemies with your hero that is more virtuous. Now, with the Enlightenment, the issue is, well, did these things really happen? And so I think that's why in the West, you have, with Christianity, it's its dominant religion, an interest in, well, what really happened? Well, that's an important question, and I'm not against the Enlightenment whatsoever. But it does mean that these stories then have a different sociological function. So they no longer are articulating borders between in-groups and out-groups. They're no longer articulating what are called the axiological commitments of voluntary social groups. They also, the case of early Christianity, this is why you have so many Christologies, because Jesus is the embodiment of the values of the in-group, but these in-groups differ from each other. So is Jesus the teacher? Is Jesus the miracle worker? Is he primarily the martyr who has salvation because of resurrection and so on? So I think we can say that the obsession for the historicity of these stories goes back to the Enlightenment. But it becomes, in biblical scholarship, in my view, often pseudo-scientific. And so it's not able to take the sociological functions of these stories as seriously as it should, because it expects the stories to be either false or historical instead of mythological. That would be part of my answer to you.
Yeah, it's conspicuous, the absence of historiological argumentation. You'd think if the foundations of the religion were these historical claims, these were the pillars of the kind of structuring early Christian thought, that you'd find quests for the historical Jesus just going on through the centuries, all the way up to the present. And really, this is almost a modern obsession, as you say, to try and uncover. It's kind of like trying to find the historical King Arthur or something like this.
Well, give an example. In the Middle East right now, Muslim scholars are having a difficult time with their own religious community because it did not go through the Enlightenment, such as you had so that scholars who are bitten by the bug of the Enlightenment and want to know what really happened to Quran, was it immediately transmitted to the Prophet and so on, are in trouble because the culture at large is not committed in the same way to the Enlightenment. Now, in other respects, it certainly is, because you think of the scientific advancements of people in the Middle East and so on. But when it comes to religion, there's squeamishness about these historical claims. Now, there's squeamishness in the West too, and so we can talk about that in our churches, in our academic situations. But I think a lot of it goes to the expectations after the Enlightenment.
I noticed during my education that a lot of my fellow students were from religious backgrounds, and these were even at the highest academies. Some of the places I had studied were places where secular work was being done. I began to become disillusioned. Then I realized that this is pretty common across the field. This is where our culture is coming from. It's not an accident that the people that are studying this are people out of our culture entering these schools that have a vested interest in pursuing.
Sure.
This in a sense, it's a religious pilgrimage that has academic kind of tool set to it. That's problematic in the sense that that's not like other fields, really. I mean, you could say that people that go into political science already have preconceived ideas that invested ideologies and this kind of thing, but as soon as you start talking about religion, I think there's an added aspect to that. You've got Pascal's wager involved and people's own existential security and life after death and familial traditions and strongly held beliefs that form identity, like you suggested. The field ends up becoming the outworking of a cultural negotiation in our time. What we're able and willing to tolerate with regard to our handling of our own sacred traditions, funded in many ways. It's our culture funding its own academic legitimation to its own mythic traditions in some ways. Maybe unwilling to do that in its most honest and pure form. And so,
well, I think the same thing happens in the academy itself, quite apart from its religious students and so on. I think what happens with scientific revolutions, including the science of biblical scholarship, is that it becomes entrenched in its own history, and it has found then institutions that support it. You've talked about a little bit about, let's say, the church as an institution that supports a certain ideology, but universities have the same thing happening. Thomas Kuhn wrote a wonderful book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and I found it to be very useful, as other humanists have, not just science, but to the academy. That is that every scientific tradition, biology, astronomy, and so on, has a history, and the history is an intellectual history by people who do experiments, beginning with Newton and so on, that are productive. And from those experiments and those revolutions, we get new science. And then scientists use that information for crafting new theories and so on, but they stay within the paradigm. What shifts the scientific paradigm is an inconvenient truth, whether it's Darwin's discovery of evolution, for example, or the discovery of penicillin, or light particles and wave theory, and so on. At that point, the science has to change. Its institutions have to change. But there's a lot of inertia from people who are the regular scientists, as opposed to the ones who are the advanced theoreticians who are using, let's say, Einstein as an example, or Darwin as an example. What's happened in biblical scholarship is that there's been a very noble history of interpretation that has been sophisticated in its own way. And it's taken us, it's created institutions, libraries, critical works, critical editions of the New Testament, and so on. But there are shortcomings in the history of the discipline. So, for example, appendix of the most commonly used Greek New Testament has over 3,000 citations of Greek poetry, the Hebrew Bible. It has 5 citations from all of Greek literature. It has only 2 from poetry. Now, how can that possibly be? It's because of the history of the discipline, that people have been interested in the New Testament, in part because it is bound with the Hebrew Bible as a part of the Bible. The New Testament had been bound with the Homeric epics, we would have had a different index.
Right.
So you see this then in almost every publication. There's a proclivity to go to Judaism and the Hebrew Bible for its antecedents instead to the world that these authors actually lived in. And so what mimesis represents is, and also certain kinds of comparative mythologies that you are working with, are inconvenient truths because they violate the canons of the science of biblical scholarship. This information, because it's a violation of the science of biblical scholarship, gets sidelined. It's much easier to avoid an inconvenient fact than to explain it. And what we find is a lack of interest in explaining your data about translation fables or mimesis in my case. So instead of getting argumentation against it, most of it is simply ignoring it because it's not a part of the party that the Guild is supporting. So take a look at where funding goes from the National Endowment for the Humanities, let's say. It's not going to projects like ours. It's going to the institutions that are already doing what I can call old biblical science. And what we need to have is paradigm shifts and to move. But our institutions are creating inertia and they're creating expectations. I just recently received a message from someone that was from a German scholar who said, don't bother with MacDonald's work. It's undergone, what he called massive criticism. They didn't read my rebuttals to my critics. They didn't give an alternative explanation of the data. There's an attempt to get rid of inconvenient truths. Thomas Kuhn ends his book, as I recall, by saying that in order for paradigms to shift, it often means the death of the perpetrators and the survival of the inconvenient truths. And I'm not wishing, this is not a death wish for my patriots, but Darwin said the same thing, that he did not expect senior people in biology to accept evolution. It was younger people who were going to make the difference. Max Planck said something very similar. He just hoped to outlive his critics. And of course, Max Planck was successful, and so was Darwin, even before they died. So I'm hoping to get some success before I die. I'm sure that you have the same gift. But I think we need to calculate intellectual inertia that is supported by institutions are perpetrating mistakes that people have made in the history of the field. Represents inconvenient truths. And I think one of the things that MythVision is trying to do is to scramble up the going trends in our field and others to say, you're missing something. You can be better scientists if you take into account these inconvenient truths.
Yeah, it makes me think about the James Webb Space Telescope and these discoveries that we have galaxies that are much older than what was originally thought regarding the Big Bang. And I have a scientific friend, a PhD in science, who's a buddy of mine who's exploring the hypothesis that maybe the universe is either eternal or far older than any of us have ever thought. And he's running into that inertia, even in the scientific...
in quantum physics,
right.
Something
It's very upsetting. And from my standpoint, even the idea of the Big Bang feels like it's got a theological... It feels like it's part of our narcissism in the West to have an anthropocentric answer to all of our scientific questions. And as we've learned, we're not the center of the solar system. We're not the center of the galaxy. We're not the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that there might not have been a theological Big Bang moment where God spoke and this kind of thing. And what does that mean for our science in the West that is so tethered, has this inertia that's infused with even completely secular science at this point because of the continued exertion of those influences in the discourse.
This is what Kuhn talked about as a paradigm shift. What we mean by a paradigm shift is largely a result of Thomas Kuhn and that kind of exploration. And what we need in our field is a paradigm shift. And those shifts happen when inconvenient truths are taken seriously and then applied rigorously to the field. And that's not happening as far as I can see.
What's strange, the point you made earlier about the lexicon and the references and all of this kind of thing, that's disturbing because at least with James Webb, we're getting new data, right? There's new data coming in that's disrupting and people have to go back to the drawing board again. We're dealing with the same data, but up to this point, neglected data.
Let me give you another example. Yeah. The Anchor Bible Dictionary, 6 volumes, small print, double columns, thousands of pages, has nothing about Virgil, nothing about Greek poetry. It does have an entry on Homer. Homer, a measure for a bushel. See weights and measures.
Oh my goodness.
Homer is entirely missing in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, which is one of the primary texts that we use. There is nothing about mimesis in the entire Anchor Bible. Homer is more important as a bushel basket than the most important poet influencing the ancient world. Virgil is absent. Now tell me that is not a problem.
Oh my goodness. And I'm not even going to ask if Romulus is in there or translation legends or any of that. I don't even need to look.
No, but that is such an indictment on the field.
Right.
An indication of the inertia of biblical scholarship. The issue about the bushel, it's more important to know about a Hebrew basket than it is a Greek poet.
And not just a Greek poet, the preeminent Greek poet, the master Greek poet, the most important literary figure in all of classical antiquity, absent. What are we studying then? You have to wonder, what is it? What are we doing?
I told you about my experience with Albert Lord, the author, singer of tales, probably one of the greatest Homeric scholars ever. He became a very good friend of mine when I was at Harvard. And I can remember these 2 questions he asked me. And this is before my own interest in Homer. I was just interested in Lord and his formulaic theories. He said, Dennis, why is it that in your field, the most important author of antiquity is not engaged? Why is Homer not treated in your field? And then he said, why is it that the most important literary part of ancient education is mimesis? And I can't find anything about mimesis when I read New Testament scholarship. And he saw it as a classicist. And he said, there's got to be something wrong with that scene.
Yeah, you see, from my standpoint, I attribute this just from my vantage point of my travels and what I've seen in all my interactions. This field is not secular. It's not defined by the strictures of secularity in any way whatsoever. The discourse, the big tent, whatever you want to call it, the group of what we consider to be the discussion feels more like, going back to my original point, it feels more like a negotiation, a cultural negotiation, one that's not yet ready to engage with some of these realities, what would be patently obvious, flagrantly obvious in any other field. If you were to study any other body of writing from that world that was composed in Greek, to neglect Homer would be criminal.
Let me give you an example of Rudolf Bultmann, who at first was one of my heroes. Now he's one of my villains. Okay. And he's also a villain to Robin Faith Walsh, for similar reasons. Bultmann's major contribution as a biblical scholar was take form criticism seriously and folklore theory, and say that the stories in the New Testament are legend. They had maybe a historical kernel. Somebody told a story, then it built up, and became these crazy stories. But they have virtue insofar as they talk about existential reality. So then he turns around from his scientific work and becomes a theologian. And so he writes a book on the theology of the synoptic tradition, the theology of the New Testament, and that kind of thing. So even our best scientists in the field end up doing theology. And it could be sophisticated, it could be psychologically satisfying, but it still is driven deeply by theology. Now, my problem with Bultmann is these stories didn't start as folklore. They started as intellectual engagements with the classical tradition. And we can forget about form criticism as providing the kind of tradition we'd expect in the Gospels. These are written by male elite intellectuals about that limited demographic, but I think that has to be the case. They're what the Greeks would call pepepemeni, that they're the educated ones. Okay. And so it's not folklore. And this is what Robin Faith Walsh has been very good about. Mm-hmm. There's a German romanticism is about form criticism and continues to have a power in Europe today, especially in Germany. But it really is pseudoscience. It's religion disguised as science. And it's an attempt to talk about the Christian ethos that has certain psychological demythologized. So I don't believe in demythologizing. I believe in transmythologizing. Okay. Right? It's not to get these myths and get them then into psychologically satisfying truths about existence, which would be theological in a way. Yeah. Rather, it's about taking mythology and using it for sociological, not psychological projects in order to establish the identity of you and your heroes over against the literature and the heroes of others. For me, that is one place we really are stuck, that our science is really driven subtly by theology.
Yeah, I think you're dealing with a body of texts that, I mean, if you look at it from this standpoint, that prevailed in antiquity. In other words, we're seeing, if you want to look at it this way, a transaction in the ancient world that succeeded. Yeah. It succeeded in effecting a full-scale revolution. Underestimate that these were bums and fishermen writing these texts. No, these were very sophisticated individuals, and these texts targeted, even if, albeit from a flanking kind of strategy, a subversive strategy, they were targeting the larger cultural capital of that world, the literary.
And they don't even agree with each other.
No.
Yeah, they're arguing with each other. That's what this book that's coming out from me, my next book, Synoptic Epistles and Homeric Epics, in the subtitle, it's the clash of the gospel authors with each other about Homeric epics and about each other's work.
Right.
So the Gospels need to be seen as competitors, not collaborators.
And on the grand stage of civilization, and not merely as private cultic self-help literature or something like this.
Exactly. Yeah, very well put.
Yeah.